Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate, a podcast by the Institute for Replication, where we put research to the test again. In this episode, we talk to Jon Hartley from the Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century podcast about open science initiatives in other subfields of economics. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Juan Pablo, joined by our co-host, Abel. And today we have a very special co-podcaster, let's put it that way. We have Jon Hartley. He's a PhD candidate at Stanford. I'll let him talk a bit about himself and his podcast. So, Jon, welcome. And why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you're doing?
Juan and Abel, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm a huge fan of the Institute for Replication. I think it's playing an extremely important role in the whole replication crisis and trying to get figure out some facts in terms of what's actually going on and what we can do about it. So one, I think it's such an important service. I really can't highlight that enough. So and thank you for the very kind introduction. So I run I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford, as you mentioned. I study a lot of empirical macro finance and labor topics. And largely a lot of stuff in finance is sort of my primary field. I sort of come to this in a sort of a weird path, in that I once worked at Goldman Sachs for a number of years, kind of where I started getting interested in finance and started getting interested in things like bonds or government debt, which is where a lot of my work is today. But I've also been doing some policy things along the way. I've spent some time working in Congress, worked on doing economic policy for the Jeb 2016 campaign at one point, and also spent a year doing analytics for the Dallas Cowboys. So that was a pretty wild and fun experience. But at Stanford, I also run a podcast at the Hoover Institution, which I sort of started maybe 3 or 4 years ago on my own. And then what I did was I kind of kept it going over time, and I had this episode that came out earlier this year that you guys and some of your listeners might have listened to with Steve Levitt, and essentially Steve Levitt, the co-author of Freakonomics, he announced his retirement on my podcast, and it really went viral, and then it really took off after that, and then shortly after it became part of the Hoover Institution. It's called the Capitalism and Freedom in the 21st Century podcast. It's a pretty broad kind of podcast. We talk about a lot of things, ranging from economic policy with policymakers, people that have served in big policy positions, but largely academics like yourselves, and what are your main contributions with your main ideas. And it's pretty across fields. It's not just macro or anything like that. We do a lot of public finance, development, and so forth. So that's the overall scope of the podcast, and it's a real honor to be able to do it.
Oh, Jon, that's so interesting. So our main idea of bringing you here was to talk initially about pre-registration. And pre-registration from a very different perspective from what we're used to it. So here in this side of the world, we're mostly used to pre-registration as someone who does empirical analysis in the micro side. So experiments, in the field experiments, lab experiments, that kind of stuff. So we were wondering, how does pre-registration looks in your side of the world within macro and finance circles?
Well, it's a great question, and so I do some work on I guess what people might call household finance or empirical corporate finance, and it's similar. I mean, in terms of how we label these fields is kind of funny, I think, in the sense that I think these definitions can become a little bit arbitrary at different points. And it's what's I think interesting about it is any empirical field suffers from the same potential challenges, right? Which is, we live in this world. If you're calculating T statistics and reporting them, I think your field likely suffers from p hacking and publication bias in some way. And yourselves and Abel have done amazing work in terms of identifying that p hacking and publication bias is apparent by just looking at the distribution of T statistics coming out of top academic journals, and looking at the fact that there's a strange amount of clustering around critical values. The 5% critical value, 1.96 and so forth. So I think that's pretty universal. There's, I think, definitely some spirited debates, which you guys are at the forefront of, but they definitely afflict every field. In finance, we have this problem called the factor zoo, which is trying to understand to what degree different finance factors have been p-hacked. I haven't been too involved in that debate, and a lot of the factor literature has kind of quickly disappeared in the past 10 years. But I do a lot of stuff on household finance, a lot of stuff on corporate finance, and I started working on sort of my first RCT about 5 years ago. It's on this sort of student debt, so it's sort of a household debt sort of topic, and we ran it with a school, a nonprofit school, and we offered these things called income share agreements. And the idea is sort of coming up with an alternative to traditional student debt, where what we do is we sort of we randomize some of the framing around how people take up these income share agreement contracts where they pay back a certain fraction of their income rather than a fixed amount. Anyways, I don't want to get too in that experiment, but yeah, no. So sort of going through that whole process and you're going through pre-registration, these sorts of things. I sort of really get interested about in this sort of issue of p-hacking publication bias. I mean, to what degree are any results that have been published since the credibility revolution in the early 90s, to what degree are they credible? I think it's interesting, looking at some of these debates about, say the Ajimoglu Johnson Robinson paper, it's about the validity of their instruments, about to what degree do certain findings hold up if you change certain specifications. I think it's such an important fight. For me, I also do a lot of macro as well. To me, I think this is identification is a huge problem for macro as well, and so I generally call myself an empirical macroeconomist. But at some level, it's hard to make really important statements without the ability to make, I think, compelling causal claims. And so this is a huge problem in macro. I feel like it's still very much behind the rest of sort of the applied micro fields in this respect. I think you're starting to see, I think, a bit of a resurgence in it. And it's interesting how macroeconomics was very, very applied pre-70s and 80s, Sargent, pre-Prescott, and then theory, all the macro theorists took over. And I feel like empirics it very much became about calibration, which personally I sort of like, I guess, am sometimes skeptical of, in terms of, sure, it's testing for, the validity of a model, but it doesn't really test for the validity of causal relationships. And so bringing in identification into macro is super important in my mind, whether it's trying to understand the effect of issuing more 10-year bonds versus 3-month treasury bills. I have a treasury debt management I have a paper on that, but trying to use sort of high frequency identification or some other form of identification, like the RCT I mentioned, randomizing some sort of contract terms. I think that's just so important. Or trying to I think there are a lot of big questions in macro that really suffer from this. So, like, for example, monetary non-neutrality. It's really hard because monetary policy is so endogenous. It's got this reaction function to inflation and unemployment. It's kind of written right there in the Taylor rule. If you sort of see the Taylor rule, it's sort of just a regression. And so trying to find big monetary shocks, and having a treatment group and a control group. I sort of have a paper on this related to what was going on in the Civil War in the eastern part of the Confederacy. Long story short, macro needs more identification. People like Nakamura, John Styson, and many others have led the way. But I think it's all related to the credibility revolution, and even though maybe it's a little later, but they all those papers potentially suffer from the same issues.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I love the way you started the podcast saying work for Dallas Cowboys, but then you move Goldman Sachs and so on, and you're just, I love your path. I love the way you're moving from one thing to the other, and what I love about what you're saying right now is what got you interested to some extent into the importance of open science. Let's say pre-registration is actually doing an experiment, is using a specific method or tool that is not really popular in finance and macroeconomics for obvious reasons. Like, we're not going to randomize who gets a recession or inflation or all these things. And I think this has.
We haven't tried it yet, at least.
Yes, exactly. We could give it a shot in some countries, but I think it's really interesting and to understand how we could actually bring specific methods or tools into macro finance by sort of looking at what's going on in other specific fields. And I think the credibility revolution, to some extent, has failed a bit of doing that. I feel, when you talk to applied microeconomists, it's really about identification, completely obsessed about it, sometimes to a detriment. I think we're thinking way too much about internal validity and not enough about external. But I feel other disciplines and other fields, even within economics, I've not benefited from this. I've not benefited from this conversation, from this discussion, and trying to understand the pros of and the cons also of using these methods. So I love the fact that you're explaining, started an experiment, an RCT, started digging, started trying to understand, okay, what's going on? We actually need to pre-register this thing. There's so many ways we could present the data, and then this leads you to actually, going down the rabbit hole of actually these problems of publication bias p-hacking can actually impact pretty much every single field. These discussions might not be as important in my own specific field or bubble, but that doesn't mean they're not. It's just that we're not having the same type of discussion. And this could be also because macroeconomics still to this day, I think, is really interested in economic theory, big ideas, and there's different schools of thoughts in a way. And the data is really hard to get. And when you have data, it's usually not really disaggregated data, interesting data where you can do tons of things. There's some limitations, and these limitations in data are actually leaving, I think, or leading to some extent to problems in terms of we cannot use other methods, and these methods actually would bring us to talk about tools that have been developed that can still be used in macroeconomics and finance. I feel pre-registration, pre-analysis plan, open data, all these discussions could actually be really useful for macroeconomics. But I feel maybe you disagree or maybe you agree, but we're not having these conversations in these specific subfields because we're not using the same methods, and the methods actually leads you to thinking more deeply about problems.
Absolutely. I think, methods kind of should come first. And I think really the things that maybe, if it was the case that maybe 30, 40 years ago, the thing that made macroeconomists sort of at war with each other were, things like sticky prices versus not having sticky prices and the RBC versus the McKinsey model. I feel like today the real schools of thought really are on methods. And it's so important. And to be honest, I think there's a lot of very stubborn macroeconomists in this regard. And in fairness to them, they grew up in a different era. But if you sort of pull open, a random macro paper, looks very, very different from any applied micro paper. And I think there's some degree, some applied micro papers are becoming a little more structural, or, IO has had some influence in the applied micro literature now. And more people are including models some degree. But a lot of these macro models are just, some of these macro papers are 100 pages. I think it's very difficult for anybody to read them, even people in the field. And there's tons of structure. And I think at some level, you have to ask, what is the point of this? Sure, there's this sort of mathematical prowess part of it, and solving models is very difficult, and find that to be amazing, that people are able to really make serious mathematical advances. But I think too, for me, sort of my litmus test is like, if my parents or say my former colleagues at Goldman Sachs can't understand what I'm working on, then I think there's a bit of a problem there. So I mean, I've really enjoyed working with faculty, including my advisors, who just have a lot of the research. I mean, obviously is very highly cited in the academic literature, but it's actually widely read by people in the public. And so, I'm a big fan of the work of folks around Stanford, especially folks like Nick Bloom and Daryl Duffy, and they work on very different things. But people in the real world are following what Nick is doing on work from home, and to what degree people are working from home. It matters for firms, it matters for workers. And similarly with Daryl, nobody understands financial plumbing better than Daryl Duffy. And so, so many people in financial markets are looking for his insights on, what's going on in financial plumbing. And there's so many related issues to that. So to me, I think whether or not your work sort of has this applicability outside of academia, to me, I think is an important litmus test. But I think a huge part of that, of course, is credibility as well. And I think that there's been probably in the past 30 years, so much p-hacking that's been going on. I think and it's what's wonderful about applied micro in general is those sorts of studies are intelligible to people in the real world, in the policy world. If you raise minimum wages in New Jersey and not Pennsylvania, is sort of the famous Card and Kruger study, very seminal study in the applied micro world that sort of kicked off diff and diff or really popularized it. That's, I think, an insight that regular policymakers can get and can at least communicate to their constituents or communicate to other people in government. But if it's the case that some of these studies have been maybe p-hacked to support certain policy conclusions, or there's some publication bias that supports certain conclusions, I think we're in a lot of trouble if it ends up being the case that some of those findings aren't replicable. There's over time, the study minimum wage, there's been thousands of minimum wage studies done. So I mean, maybe at some level, successive studies are doing sort of these robustness exercises, but I still think too that there's these the whole p-hacking publication bias thing can still distort even those follow-on studies too. So it's a strange time, and I don't know how we kind of come out of it. I mean, it's amazing to see things like 10 years ago or 2013, the launch RCT registry, and that's something that's related to our paper on pre-registration. But just in recent years, journals are requiring data editors to go through things. I feel like that's a huge shift in the sense that someone's actually very closely checking your work. I don't know. I'd be interesting to check to see if there's like an uptick in retractions or something like that. Or I think this is these are very new things, but I think at some level, I do think that some of these. I'm hoping that some of these new ideas in the journal editing process are going to have an effect on making studies more credible and reducing p-hacking publication bias.
Yeah, I think
I'll go for it.
No, I was just gonna say we had an episode actually 1 or 2 weeks ago with one of the data editors at Econometrica, and
Wow.
It was quite interesting to talk to him and just the process of what they're actually doing and just anecdotal evidence of what happens when you actually uncover that there's actually serious problems. And I think he mentioned that one paper at one point had to be retracted. It was conditionally accepted. It was not published yet, but they had to remove it because the author realized actually, the codes or whatever we initially provided don't actually lead to the results in the article. And we need to fix coding errors. And so I think it's definitely happening. So what you're saying is more than, just anecdotal evidence. It's actually leading to real differences. And I really want to touch, and maybe this is where Juan Pablo was going, I want to touch on this idea of research could actually be useful for policymakers. And I think, the election just happened in the US. I think a lot of people, Americans, Canadians, Europeans, have less and less trust in scientists. And I sort of feel like we as a science body, or just as a group of researchers, you need to take this seriously. And you need to start thinking how can we make research more credible for the public, for policymakers? Otherwise, what's the point? Why are we spending all our time trying to do all these research papers if they're not actually useful down the line for knowledge accumulation, but also policymakers? And I don't know, you've worked, I've been pretty much all my life in academia, a bit outside of academia, but more mostly minimum wage jobs, so not really relevant. But can you talk more about how much is research potentially useful at Federal Reserve, governments? How you've talked about it's really important to do research that actually is understandable for policymakers, for people outside of academia, and how much is trust important? Have you had conversations with people can we really trust this type of studies? Is it type of conversations people are having at the feds or elsewhere where you've worked?
Let me jump on that bandwagon, because I think macro and macrofinance is uniquely positioned to answer this type of questions, because we as microeconomists who do development, we would like to think that our work influences policy, right, in an ideal world, but oftentimes that's not the case, right? Oftentimes our papers are very specific. They answer very specific questions that our policymakers are not really interested in. But When it comes to macro and microfinance, the impression as an outsider is that you guys are working very closely with the private sector, right? And that closeness to the private sectors allows you to understand the needs of people outside academia. In a sense, that allows you to have a greater feeling or a better fit or a better understanding of what pre-registration is, just because you're dealing with quote unquote clients that would want to hire you for some specific stuff. So do you think macro people have always done pre-registration, but they have just called it something else, and there's a lot of stuff they can teach the rest of the profession?
Those are great questions. So I guess maybe starting with the macro finance side of things. So yeah, I think I don't think that macro and finance folks work closely enough with practitioners at all, and it's kind of weird. And having sort of been on both sides of it, again, I worked at Goldman Sachs for 5 years, and in fact, some of the best research ideas I have sort of been informed by some of that. But I think part of the challenge is that there's a certain institutional sort of knowledge thing about how, at least in finance, how certain financial markets work that it's hard to get if you're outside of it. And even just data issues, like getting like minutely financial markets data, high frequency financial markets data is extremely expensive and very, very difficult to get. And most grad students, even professors, don't have great access to that. There's been definitely improvements on housing data over time. Data sets like CoreLogic are at certain universities pretty widely available. For example, at Stanford, pretty much any student has access to that. I mean, data sets on firms like Orbis, I think, are available to a lot of students. So there's been, I think, inroads in subfields and just in terms of the data perspective or data availability perspective. But I think there's challenges, like, for example, like if you want to do high frequency identification, in any kind of asset, I think that's not something that's totally possible for grad students or professors even. And so I think it's harder for them to get access to that, to test the exact things that they want to test. I think there's just on the institutional sort of gaps. I mean, one thing that I think is a very powerful force for writing papers I think are very convincing in finance is the concept of arbitrage. And many papers have sort of been, many, I think, of the more successful papers in finance and academia have sort of been in this area. And I mean, Eugene Fama has this famous saying, which I love, and I sort of agree with it to some degree, which is that finance has been, or financial economics has been the most successful subfield of economics. And I just, for my podcast, was interviewing Myron Scholes recently, and it's amazing to see how far financial economics has come since like the 50s and 60s. Prior to the 50s and 60s, people thought finance was just like, financial markets were just supply and demand curves to some degree. And we're actually, behavioral economics is kind of getting back to that to some degree, behavioral finance. And there's a famous Andre Schleifer paper, that titled, does the demand curve for a stock slope down? But the idea of bringing in information about things, replicating cash flows, the whole concept of arbitrage and no arbitrage pricing came in through really through the 60s and 70s. Things like the cap, the idea that a stock, some systematic component to it that's very correlated with the market. The idea of correlations, that all came in the 50s and 60s with Harry Markowitz. So and pricing options and things like that came in as well. And I mean, those were huge contributions, and people in the real world used all those things and still do to this day. So that I think is a huge contribution on that part. But I still think that I see papers, and I've written papers that kind of respond to some of these issues. Like, I have this one paper in the Journal of Financial Economics that kind of goes at this arbitrage that another paper had pointed out, trying to use 3 different securities and trying to replicate something called a U.S. Treasury floating rate note using a fixed rate bond, an interest rate swap, and something called a Treasury LIBOR basis swap. And they claim that if you use those things, you can replicate the Treasury floating rate note. But one of those securities, though, has actually been totally illiquid, and there's only been 12 trades in that security since the global financial crisis. And you wouldn't know that fact. Even looking at a Bloomberg, there's still quotes on this thing called a Treasury LIBOR basis swap, but they're very wide quotes. The thing is, certain brokers will still provide these quotes, even if they're not being traded. So you wouldn't really know that this security hasn't been traded since the financial crisis. The so-called TED spread, or the difference between the U.S. Treasury yield and the LIBOR, basically exploded. But you wouldn't know that the Treasury LIBOR basis swap hasn't been traded, or only been traded like 12 times since, which is like nothing. If you talk to people in financial markets, and that's kind of what I did, and then went further and getting data on the from this repository. It's called the DTCC. It's a longer story, but sort of further digging. So the whole point is, like, I think it's very easy, even in finance, to be led astray if you don't, if you aren't very, at least in asset pricing, talking very, very closely with practitioners. I think that's super important. On the dev side of things, I think dev is probably one of the most successful fields as well in terms of like real world impact. The one person who I really like to think of a lot is like Michael Kramer. I think Michael Kramer has probably had more real impact than probably any other development or any other economists out there alive today, possibly. And I was I've been thinking about this in kind of recent weeks, and it's amazing to think about things like RCTs is probably one of the biggest shifts. And I mean, Dev, I think, is incredibly successful in convincing governments to work with them. And, I see these papers on like tax audits now, and like, researchers are able to convince governments to let them, randomize tax audits. Or people like Paul Niehaus and co-authors, have started these incredible charities like Give Directly, and are helicopter dropping millions of dollars, $30 million into Kenya, and randomizing what towns or villages that they're being dropped in. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, that's also answering huge macro questions to some degree too. And I think, it's a bit silly to say like, well, it's development economics if it's happening outside the advanced economies, right? I mean, at some level, these are people, and those people are really no different than us, biologically and anthropologically. And so, to me, it's such an amazing thing to see the success of RCTs, and just the kind of partnerships and research designs that are being used. At some level, it's very difficult to do some of that kind of research, even in advanced economies. But also, Michael Kramer thinking about things like advanced market commitments, and the pneumococcal vaccine advanced market commitment, and to the degree that influenced policymakers in the U.S. on Operation Warp Speed and getting the COVID vaccines out quickly. So I think, and then there's other amazing paper, more macro theory papers like the O-ring theory paper, and there's the paper that's sort of looking at endogenous growth and ideas, how they formed in Europe, and anyways, it's there's a couple other Michael Kramer papers. I think those are certainly, I think, that the high points for economists. I do think, though, to answer your question in hopefully a succinct way, I don't think that policymakers really do, unfortunately, pay much attention to economists in either party. And I think I do think what happens in both, there's this strange thing that happens in academia, and this was part of what actually Steve Levitt spoke a little bit about when he came on my podcast, which was Steve, kind of said, well, this is one of the crazier things they said on the podcast. He said that he thought he had no policy influence. And the reason why was that even though, like, he has this amazing story where when he was an MIT grad student, Steve Levitt, some of his crime papers in the 90s were being circulated through the White House, through a few people who are working there, and from academia who are working there. The point was, and he had some, I think, paper on how more police or something like that reduce crime, something like that. And I think, but the point was that even though, I think it's amazing, to be a grad student and have people in the White House reading your paper, I think that's an incredible feat. But what he said was, like, the reason why they were reading the paper wasn't that it was some incredible insight. I mean, there were tons of papers that found that more police reduce crime, but they just already had this preconceived policy conclusion, which was they wanted to be more tough on crime. And so they found his paper as the paper that would confirm that previously drawn policy conclusion. So I think that is kind of everywhere. And you see there's a lot of academics and people who are writing papers that are on policies that are palatable to either party or what have you. I think there is a lot of what I will just call activism in academia, and I'm sure you guys see this a lot. And it's a bit sad. I mean, it is like I think a great honor that economists out of any discipline are really one of the few in the social sciences to be asked even to be advisors to to say politicians, or we have the Council of Economic Advisors. Many countries have their own variation on that. You have the Federal Reserve System, which hires a lot of economists, the World Bank and the IMF. But at some level, I think you have to ask, like, to what degree are they willing to? Is there some openness to debate and openness to actually go through the empirical literature? And I guess on the Fed side, I think the Fed is, they maintain a lot of these DSGE models. I think, and one of the things we talked about in the podcast is like whether these things are actually useful or not. And I think that there's some very hardcore FOMC members who are very, very steeped in these sorts of models, and DSGE models, the equation DSGE models, to understand them well. But I think that the truth of the matter is most central bankers don't really care about the odd whatever sort of the output of a DSGE model is. And they are forecast with a grain of salt, but often they're sort of reacting loosely following something that looks like a Taylor rule, and are sort of going by sort of a reaction function that reacts pretty sharply to certain events, whether it's big downturns and things like that, or inflations. But at some level, I think the degree to, even though there is a huge machinery of economists that are maintaining DSGE models, how they're actually being, I think it's a massive subsidy to the DSGE sort of modeling literature, but how useful it actually is I think a big question. So I'm a big fan of things like GDP Now, which is sort of a nowcast of GDP. All these sort of innovative things happen in the Federal Reserve System or at the World Bank and the IMF, and I'm a big fan of those sorts of things when they pop up. And there's some great research that's being done in the Federal Reserve System, especially on the empirical side.
I think not that I'm going to push back on, research is not necessarily useful for policymakers and all of that. I unfortunately have to agree with most of what you just said. But recently, talking to someone at CBO who was, they're not going to impact my understanding, in the US. They wouldn't necessarily impact on like whether a policy or not is passed or not, but they can decide like, how much budget we're talking about. They can provide like information or just provide like some framework, and I do think they would care about like having just better research out there. And I don't necessarily see research as a way to change the way people necessarily are going to think about a specific issue. And the examples that you've mentioned are very similar to my personal experience. At one point I was invited to go talk as a witness to the US Congress about mass shootings. And from the get-go, I thought like this is going to be completely useless. Like Republicans want more guns, Democrats want less guns. And my research was not about this, it was about like the economic consequences of mass shootings. But I was not fooling myself. It's not like, you start talking about like, oh, we need less guns or more guns, or here's a new study that shows that actually most mass shootings do not end up with the police arriving on time and like killing the perpetrator. It's just not happening. But you have information like this that you can use, and people can frame it the way they want, and they're going to try to make it fit whatever they're trying to say. This, I agree with you. But I think deep down, some of these conversations are shaped with evidence. And over time, the knowledge that we're building sort of shapes conversation that people are having. And I don't think in the short run it's really happening. You release a paper and then all of a sudden everybody's going to change their mind about something. Like I can think only of maybe 3 or 4 papers I've ever read or studies that I was like, wow, it literally changed the way most people were thinking. And one that comes to mind right now is at one point in the 90s, there was a report saying that, if you have an infant, you should have the infant sleeping on his back or her back. And that is going to significantly decrease SIDS. And people were just like, oh, really? Let's do this. And out of nowhere, the number of infants that would die in their sleep decreased by 90% or something crazy. So there's cases like this, but I think for the most part, it's more about we do research. We're trying to build knowledge. We're trying to build a set of here's what we know. And your example about the minimum wage is great because I think before Card and Kruger, there was all these theories about the minimum wage, but once you start seeing actual evidence with data, it can actually lead to okay, yeah, but the conversation should be reshaped. Actually, now that we think from a theoretical perspective, it's actually possible that it has a positive effect and not like a negative effect on employment. Now you start thinking about different class of models, theories, and And I think, Democrats obviously love that paper. But I think it just shapes the type of conversation we're having. And I see evidence as more shaping conversations rather than completely changing the way people are thinking. So I agree with you. I'm incredibly cynical in general about like research leading to policy making. But I think it's important also to say like conversations can be shaped in different ways with different evidence over time. And
I
yeah,
think
I guess there's a
one
bit of nuance, but maybe you disagree.
one thing that I find really interesting is something John said a bit ago. The fact that people find research that fit their priors. So I see this as a real issue, and I see that every day. But the natural question becomes, is there anything we can do to avoid these practices? And is there anything open science is doing towards improving the status quo? By that I mean, is open science helping or being a catalyzer for the problem? Like, does a policymaker really care about pre-registration or all the open science initiatives? Or are these acting as a sort of a filter for bad research to be put out there? So people that are looking to fish for research are simply not finding some paper that has like shaky research practices. Do you think that's the case?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think at some level, the goal of open research, I mean, I'm sure most congressmen, most policymakers have never heard of pre-registration before, but I think that's okay. I think the goal of pre-registration and all these open science practices have to be to change like the incentives of economists in certain ways. And I think, I think that many economists, especially, I think on the older side of things, are very averse to any open science discussion at all. Just because, I mean, if you've been publishing for 30, 40 years, last thing you want is your work that's accumulated many citations to face some sort of questioning, right? And so I think there is this real question, which is like, do we have to replicate every single paper that's been written, every major paper that's been written in the past 35 years? And I feel like IFR is on the way to doing this. If there's anyone that could do this, it would be IFR. But I think that's a real, I think, kind of open question. Which results replicate, which ones don't. There's other great journals out there on replication too, and there's a lot of great efforts. I mean, Critical Finance Review is kind of one that's in the finance world. Eva Welsh runs that, but I mean, there's many others. But I guess the thing that I always find strange is, and I don't think that some of these replication things are new, but it's just like, what is the reaction to that when we find that AJR doesn't really replicate so well, or there's some challenges with the instrument, or if you change one thing on the democracy indices that in the democracy causes growth paper, it doesn't really work so well. So what is the reaction to that? And what I think has been a little bit fruitful, at least sort of following some of the Twitter discussion around the AJR Nobel announcement. I love Jeroen Edgemoglu, and I love those papers. And I think they're an amazing first attempt at trying to seriously use good identification and reduced form analysis to get at these huge questions of like, why are countries rich and poor? Do institutions matter? And I think that alone is a Nobel worthy sort of contribution, just elevating that conversation. I mean, look at North Korea and South Korea. One's very prosperous, one's not, and institutions certainly have something to do with it, right? I think just popularizing ideas is a Nobel worthy contribution. But what was nice to see with that was that there was this whole conversation at least going on at least within the Twitter sphere and elsewhere amongst academics about like, wow, this thing doesn't really replicate so well. And there was another paper that was written sort of 10 years later and was published as an AER comment. I think that's promising, but at some level, I think you also have to ask, well, then why they still win the Nobel Prize, right? And so I think, but in fairness, I mean, they did do something that was very new, and so what is the right approach to having that conversation? I mean, you don't exactly want to run around sticking your finger in people's eyes, saying that your paper doesn't replicate, but I think, how do we change our incentives to start actually being in favor of that? Certainly, like data editors and making that mandatory is huge. And I think making pre-registration mandatory is huge too. And the paper that Abel and I and other co-authors wrote, we do one. I mean, it's one surprising thing is that if you look at the sort of amount of p-hacking we're clustering around these critical values in a pre-registered study. It's actually really no different from a non-pre-registered RCT. But if you look at things like, the studies that include pre-analysis plans or some discussion of power, statistical power, there is a bit less p-hacking. So, at some level, I think we've got a long, long way to go. And there are certain, I think, some ideas, other ideas too, that may be very promising that we sort of, I think, have to test and see how they work. Like things like, submitting a paper before you run your tests and
Registered reports, yeah.
sort of try and avoid this publication bias issue, right? What do people do when they find that they don't have statistically significant results? They send it to the file drawer. I mean, what do we do with all those no result papers? And so I think we have a lot of figuring out to do, and it's still very early to even figure out what works in open science. But I think shaping these incentives, like, it would be great if we had some sort of like a super, I think, prestigious prize or something like that for doing replications or something like that, because maybe it's up to IFR to create this, or maybe it's already been created in some way. I think this idea of doing these big meta papers, I think, is awesome, because it gives a little incentive to all these authors to do a replication. And if you get 300 people together and do this thing that really hasn't really been done before, in doing sort of these mass scale replications, that'll tell us something. But they also have this incentive that there's probably a good chance of it being published well. So I think it's really all about incentives, I think, and how you change those incentives, I think, is going to be a really big thing. But I'm sorry, this is a roundabout way of talking about the policymakers. I do think that there are lots of people in government who understand these issues very, very well. The CEA understands these issues very, very well. There's Fed staffers who understand these issues very, very well. And there are some people, at the top of these organizations who understand these things very, very well. I do think that there is a bit of a challenge that economists face right now. And I do think that we're actually losing some ground in the sense that, there's fewer PhD economists on the Fed board today than there were 15 years ago. I'd say the CEA is much less influential than it was 15 years ago. And elsewhere too, you can find, like, for example, the FTC. I mean, the FTC isn't listening to economists, and it's run by lawyers. It always has been a little bit run by lawyers to some degree, but they're certainly not listening to the sort of standard consumer welfare analysis that economists have developed over the past 40, 50 years or so. And so in a strange way, I think economists have lost ground. Maybe that changes. Certainly, the FTC is going to change, and maybe it'll revert back. But I think, broadly speaking, I think economists have to also do a better job of reaching the public in interesting ways. And through podcasts like this, I think is one way. But making things digestible. I think there are people out there who want to learn about economics. I mean, these are all such big, important topics, and economists have a great tool set. I think empirical tools are so useful. So I think people ask these sorts of questions, about whatever fields, why countries are rich or poor, what's the impact of interest rates on consumption and growth, and so forth. But I think communicating with the public in a better way is a huge part of that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to react to. One of them is we do have awards. This should be announced very shortly. So best replication, best reproduction. It's our second year doing this, so I don't think they're as prestigious as most awards. Anyway, we like them anyway. So
you have to start somewhere.
I'm exactly. Sure you have
Nobel
to start.
Prize and John Bates Clark Medal. Its first year.
Exactly.
I'm sure people had no idea what that was, right?
Yes, but I want to react to the conversation about, like, did this paper about colonizers and Ashimoglu et al., does this replicate or not? And one thing that should be noted is the document that actually described where they were awarded this, the Nobel Prize. That is, some people say it's not a real Nobel Prize. Whatever, people can think whatever they want. Anyway, it's announced on Monday the following week, so maybe there's a reason for that. But in the document explaining, they do actually mention the replication. They do mention the comment, and I think, to me, there's a lot of misunderstanding about, like, what does that comment mean? When a paper does not replicate, it doesn't mean that the claim made in the original study are completely wrong. It means that, to me at least, potentially, allegedly, the claims that are based on the methods, based on the empirical evidence presented in the article, do not replicate. But I think you would have to be completely stupid not to believe that institutions don't matter at all. I think most people agree. I think, David Abouy, who wrote the comment, would probably agree. The idea is more, can we take that specific study, the design, the data, and so on, and if we poke around, we look for coding errors, things like this, do we end up with the same conclusion as the authors? But even if you find that this is not the case, that just means that with this specific equation that you're estimating, it's not the case. That doesn't mean that in general, the theory that institutions don't matter is not true. So I think, when people were thinking like, do we care about that paper? Well, that paper started to some extent, I would say, a trend of using instrumental variables for trying to understand the role of institutions. And then later on, Melissa Dell had a paper using regression discontinuity design to try to understand better. So it just starts trends. And this is basically what usually economists are receive awards for. You start a subfield, like Steve Levitt, to some extent, is one of the person who really pushed for looking at the economics of crime. Just that in itself is a huge contribution to me. So when I think about all these papers on colonizers, do I believe the quality of the data, are there coding errors and so on? No, I don't buy that study. But even if that study would be amazing, I wouldn't buy the IV anyway. Like, this is a really long time ago. Do we even believe most of the studies that were published during those years? This is like 20 something years ago. Empirical economics has moved so much. No way I believe the vast majority of these studies that were published back then. It's just complete nonsense. Nobody would write them. The authors of these studies would not write that paper like nowadays. So you have to put this into perspective. Like, what we're doing is not like rocket science. At the end of the day, it's like social science. And we're changing over time the methods you were using. And I guess, just trying to wrap this up and trying to bring this back to the beginning. We're using better methods. Hopefully this leads to better research. And hopefully this leads to better communication with people outside of academia. But anyway,
Absolutely.
lots of things to talk about, I guess. I really got excited when you were talking about all these things.
I think that's a great note to end this stuff. I think we're over time, but if you have any last reactions, we just would love to have it.
Well, I honestly, I think what IFR is doing, in my opinion, is in the long run a Nobel-worthy contribution. And I'm just because I think it's going to take a lot more work to convince people that replication matters and that these open science practices are so important. But it is, it's slowly, you're seeing some of it already happening, but I think there's still so much more room for follow through. And there is this challenge, which is, how do you fight this very, very, very serious problem of p-hacking and publication bias? I don't see p-hacking publication bias going away anytime soon. And you even have to convince some people that it's a problem too, because some people will say, well, it's not a problem if people just throw away, the non-significant results, the null results. And
I think it's worse than this, John. I get referee reports often claiming that there is no p-hacking and publication bias in economics. And I'm a fool for claiming that there is. So some people, it's not even a definition argument. It's really like arguing that there's no such thing as specification searching happening in economics in top journals. So I agree with you. We are years and decades away from convincing everyone that this is a big deal, if ever.
Well, it's such an important effort because at some level, if studies are just being p-hacked and ultimately if the findings don't hold up over time and aren't robust, what are we doing? I think that's, to me, it's like, the reason why I'm in this is in this whole academic game is for truth. And I think if people aren't in it for truth, before justice, before policy, before whatever, what might be a wonderful passion in terms of why you're doing this. I think nothing can supersede truth, and any time that something does, I think it's become a very, very dangerous thing, or it's no longer really a truly academic exercise, and then it becomes an exercise in egoism or activism or whatever it is, but it's just, it's so important. We have to be interested in understanding how things really work, and that needs to be the primary thing. And so I really applaud you guys in terms of what you're doing, and I think it's such a huge step forward, that there are people that are really dedicated to this issue, full time, and who are totally focused on it. And I hope to be as helpful as I can in the future going forward.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being here, being on the podcast, spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. We had a blast.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.